Hello, everyone. Here are some questions, some review questions, which I will talk about that are for the Mill exam, really. Just a review of the basic issues, what I think are the most important ideas, questions, as we move through the 4 chapters of Mill's utilitarianism that we read. Chapter 1, which is a preliminary chapter, explain what Mill means by the criterion of right and wrong. I think that is pretty basic thing to understand as he's presenting this whole, not just this chapter, but the whole book. The criterion of right and wrong, what else does he call it? The summum bonum, the foundation of morality. What he is saying in the opening of this chapter is that this has been a matter of dispute for a long time amongst philosophers. That is, what is the criterion of right and wrong? And he means to supply it. He means to say what it is. What is the criterion of right and wrong, the real one, to specify it. But what's important before we actually look at his proposal, which is, of course, the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility, before we actually look at his answer to what he believes to be the actual criterion of right and wrong, I do think it's important to have an understanding of what that means for something to be the foundation of morality, the summum bonum, our greatest good, the criterion of right and wrong. And that's actually quite important, right? Because the idea is that if we had the actual real criterion of right and wrong, then we would have a reference or a standard by which to judge any particular act as being right or wrong, if it actually conformed to the principle, that is, it either does or doesn't. So we have a criterion for judging because we have a general principle of what constitutes right and wrong in any action. We would have a principle for judging rightly, I suppose, any particular action, that is, whether it was morally right or morally wrong. So I think it's quite important to see what he's looking for in that so-called criterion of right and wrong. Mill thinks that it is uniquely important for moral philosophy, as opposed to other studies like algebra and physics, to discover its own first principles. Why? One of the things that he says, and he's way out of my league, I have to say, in terms of my understanding of mathematics and science, but one of the interesting things he says is that algebra, it has perhaps first principles, but the ones that have been proposed are rather, he says, absurd, I think. And most people who use algebra have no concept of what the first principles are, and it doesn't matter. And that's true for most things. That is, the foundations, the first principles, are not really that important in mathematics and natural science, physics and chemistry. Those things go on. That is, you build up mathematics, you build up physics, and then you say what the first principles are. But moral philosophy, he says, is different because it's about ends and purposes. So if we're trying to do what's good, we have to have a general notion of what the good is. Compare it to something like arithmetic. You can do basic arithmetic, maybe not so more complex arithmetic, without really having a clear definition of number or equality or something like that. You don't need to be able to define what a number is before you can say what 2 plus 2 is. But in moral philosophy, it's different because moral philosophy is about goals, purposes, ends. So what we do will be determined by what we consider to be the good. What do we consider to be the end or purpose? So it is uniquely important for moral philosophy to discover its own principles, that is, its own criteria, its own foundation. Mill suggests that Kant, with regard to the first categorical imperative, is actually employing utilitarian ideas. How so? Well, you just have to look for his mention of Kant. I won't even say any more than that, because he explains it much better than I could possibly say. But look at his mention of Kant in chapter 1. It is apparently about the first categorical imperative, and look at his criticism of Kant. Not that he thinks it's a bad principle, but look at especially what he regards to be Kant's reasoning for the how, his explanation of what the first categorical imperative is. You'll see that, and Mill is not the only one who believes this. That Kant was really leaning on some kind of consequentialism when he conceived of the first categorical imperative. Chapter 2, which is really the longest and perhaps most important chapter in the book, what is the greatest happiness principle or principle of utility? That's just basic, right? You just obviously need to know that. And explain how it can serve as a criterion of right and wrong. This is just sort of showing that you understand what the general concept of a criterion of right and wrong actually means, and how the greatest happiness principle could serve as one. Really, it's a matter of remembering that we're talking about casuistry here. We're talking about the application of general principles to particular cases. And the greatest happiness principle is that general principle. How does the greatest happiness principle define happiness? Well, that's just basic too, right? He comes out and says it. And this is connected with the next question: explain how utilitarianism is a kind of hedonism. What does Mill say is the only thing desirable in itself? Well, that's also connected with the previous two questions and is really basic to understanding Mill. Explain how utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. Well, that's also basic. Won't say anything about that. Here, this quote, it's a very famous quote: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Put this quote in context. What is Mill trying to prove here? Well, it just takes a basic reading. This comes at the end of at the end, but is part of an argument where he has presented the greatest happiness principle. Which of course has also defined what happiness is, and he is defending the principle against possible objections. It's absolutely basic. You just need to read it. Well, what does Mill say is the proof that the higher pleasures are more pleasurable than the lower ones? Well, that again is also basic. I think anybody who's read that section will know what the answer is. Chapter 3 of the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility. The title of this chapter is "Of the Ultimate Sanction of the Principle of Utility." What is Mill looking for here? Especially, how is he using the word sanction? I think that's something that really emphasized in class. It's always important to answer that question: what is the author looking for here? What are they trying to discover? What's the basic question that they're asking? Because if you can't really answer that, you really don't know what's going on. The key here, of course, is the specific meaning of the word sanction. What does Mill say are the external sanctions of the principle? This distinction between external sanctions, external motives, and internal ones is important. The external ones, it's pretty obvious what they are. The internal ones, not so obvious. What does Mill mean by the greatest happiness morality? Well, this is really, as I was saying in class when I was giving my talk on this chapter, it's not so obvious exactly what it is that Mill is trying to find the sanction for or sanction of. It's certainly not the greatest happiness principle as it stands in chapter 2. It's rather what he calls the greatest happiness morality, mission that we must take into consideration the happiness of others, and that when we're applying the principle, we cannot do it in a selfish way, and even stronger than that, that we can't privilege our own happiness over anybody else's whose happiness is involved, at least, who has a real interest. That would be the greatest happiness morality, and in looking the sanction of it, that's what he's looking for. Explain the importance here of cultivation of the feelings. Again, Mill's emphasis on education, the need for people to develop themselves and be given the opportunity to develop themselves, not only for themselves, but for society, and the notion that a feeling for the greatest happiness morality is something that would naturally develop out of an education in which our feelings had a chance to be cultivated. Chapter 4, the last chapter we looked at, the idea of to what extent the greatest happiness principle can be proved. Explain why Mill thinks it is so difficult to prove the greatest happiness principle. Well, I'll just tell you that it's not anything particular about morality or the greatest happiness principle that makes it difficult to prove. You just have to understand what a first principle is, and then it'll be obvious that it's difficult to prove what a first principle is in general. Mill claims that happiness is the only thing we desire. That's very important. And to prove that maybe would be to prove the greatest happiness principle. How does he respond to the objection that we desire at least one other thing, virtue, or doing what's right? This is actually quite interesting part of the book, where you might say that this is where the divergence between Kant and Mill is the most obvious on this question. So these are just the kind of questions that, if you feel comfortable answering these, responding to these, if you understand these questions and you can sketch out answers to them, you will do fine on the exam.